Good day, welcome to you all. Welcome to you all, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Vibodh Parthasarathi, Geert Lovink from Amsterdam, Brett from Berlin, and these are three specialists. I'm sure you hate me calling you specialists on internet from three different cities, two different continents. So a great welcome to you all. Brett, please, over to you.
Yeah, so this week, this week's talk, we're hosting Vibodh Parthasarathi, who is a multidisciplinary scholar who specializes in media policy, creative industries, and policy literacy. He's associate professor at the Center for Media, Culture, Media, and Governance at Jamia Millia Islamia. He's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Media, Data, and Society at Central European University. He's held visiting positions at the University of Queensland, KU Leuven, the University of Helsinki, IIT Bombay, and Lund University. Vibodh has been at the forefront of media policy research in India and has won numerous awards, including from the Ford Foundation, Canada's International Development Research Centre, and the University Grants Commission. His latest work, which shares the same title as today's talk, I'll show a picture of it, Platform Capitalism in India. This was published last year. And his other works include the double volume, The Indian Media Economy, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and the three-part volume, Communication Processes, published by Sage in 2007, 2009, and 2010. Let me see, stop share. So Vibodh serves in positions of governance at the Center for Internet and Society and the Media Foundation, and also serves in advisory roles with book series at MIT Press, Oxford University Press, and is associate editor of the Journal of Digital Media and Policy. This week, we're also lucky enough to have with us Geert Lovink, who's going to be today's discussant. Geert is no stranger to the series. He gave a talk with us last year. He's the founder of the Institute of Network Cultures at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. His last three books include Social Media Abyss, published in 2016, Organization After Social Media, published in 2018, and Sad by Design, which was published in 2019. So with that, I will pass the torch to Vibodh. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks Jan for shepherding all this together. It's a very impressive series this year. Thanks Brett for the poster in particular, and it's lovely to have Geert sort of poking on my work after I finish presenting today. Let me just do the screen share. Is that? Right, yeah, is that? Okay, so I can't see all the slides because I've got some of your pictures there, but so evolution of platform capitalism in India. And so this is, I think, as Brett said, it's taking off from the edited volume I did last year, but it also sort of includes some of the motivations that went into thinking about that volume, and also my work since then. So as an overture, I'll just talk a little bit about the market idea in media studies, because that's something where I have a long-term thinking about the idea of the market, especially in complex economies like India. I'll talk briefly, try and capture the core of the volume, which essentially is arguing for a market's approach towards platforms here. And then I'll sort of pick up two cases, two sites of platformization in India, which is my work since the book came out. And I'll focus on some of the peculiarities of the platform phenomena in India. So I think I've been interested in this sort of thinking through the idea of the market, and ever since we've had deregulation in the wider economy and subsequently in the media economy, the word market sort of constantly is there in all publications. And it takes sort of different forms. There are different meanings ascribed to that. But it's never really been kind of clear in terms of what is this idea of the market, how is it being used in our intellectual history. But looking beyond India, I think there are sort of three kinds of emphasis when talking about the market idea. One, of course, comes from economics, where the emphasis has been on products which are generated by media markets, and therefore the emphasis on dual and triple products as defining media markets as opposed to markets in other sectors of the economy. And then, of course, from economic sociology, we have what I call attended markets, where one is trying to imagine markets at the interface of products, labor, and audiences. And therefore, markets are spawned by different permutations of these three. And then, of course, we have folks from law, competition law in particular, who are sort of focusing, as they've done traditionally from the Chicago School, on product and geographical markets. This sort of neatness in the idea of the market has got a little bit ruffled in terms of when I start looking at South Asia as a whole there. And there's sort of two prominent reasons for this. One, of course, is the multiplicity of languages, and therefore what that does to media products. I think because a fair amount of work trying to theorize media products was conducted in unilingual markets, there is an assumption that media products exist only in one language. And therefore, the whole idea of a product gets further complicated when we talk about the idea of a product existing in multiple languages. And the second thing which seems to have ruffled the neatness of sort of traditional conceptions of markets are the externalities, or often talked in terms of extra economic interests, which tend to shape markets. Often they're also called spoilers, but these spoilers are clearly sort of very strong historical actors, which very much are part of the market system rather than being outside that. And therefore, I mean, my thinking on media markets sort of tends to look at them as being embedded in long-standing networks of identity and power. And I'll give perhaps some examples of that as I look into my cases. So the sort of the embedded nature of media markets perhaps is the most defining trait of media systems here. And that, in a sense, if we put that in the forefront, then the way we understand the development of market systems also undergoes a different kind of spin. And in a sense, that's the way I came to understanding or looking at the idea of platforms. My interest in platforms came not from technology, not from law, but trying to understand the expansion of media markets. And I think the early emphasis in the platform idea was what could be called an affordances-based approach. Platforms were looked upon in terms of providing certain kind of affordances. And together with that, but not as pervasive, was the contention that platforms signify a particular kind of rupture. And which is why I guess platforms right now are highly talked about in media studies and disciplines around that. And I think for me, these two tendencies, they remind me of debates on new media about 20 years ago, where again the focus was on elements of novelty as defined by functionality and usage. Okay, and largely to the detriment of ignoring the underlying structures and hence focusing on elements of continuity. So that idea of rupture, which was there in debates on new media, which of course subsequently got streamlined, and the emphasis on functionality is something which I see coming back in early debates on the platform idea. As opposed to this, I mean, some of us were thinking about what would a market's approach to platforms be here. And if that is an approach, then could we see platforms to signify an evolution of pre-existing market systems there? And both in the book and elsewhere, I've sort of talked about platforms in terms of reinstitutionalizing forms of market systems. Yeah, so they're not necessarily creating new products there, but they are reorganizing products in new configurations. Yeah, and one of the key things, of course, of these reorganized market systems is the interdependency between different types of marketplaces. Okay, so in a sense, platforms then essentially try to aggregate publics and derive value from overlapping market processes. Okay, which is why, of course, in economics, the sort of emphasis on multi-sided markets, that tradition has contributed to understanding platformization in very different ways. Yeah. But it's not just multiple products, but it's also the simultaneity of the transactions which define platform markets. Okay. So in that sense, profits are generated not only through transactions, but also during each transaction. And that essentially is where we look at the roots of the data economy. So at moments of transaction itself, profits are getting generated rather than only through transactions. And of course, lastly, to try and perhaps understand platforms as ways in which the social is getting reformulated there. Because what we also see in platforms is that the domain of the social is getting mined, abstracted, and marketized there. And I'll give one example about that as we go ahead there. So this is sort of broadly a kind of framework of thinking of the platform idea from a markets approach here. And there are perhaps three benefits from a kind of markets approach to platforms here. One, of course, is the idea of understanding novelty through the evolution of market dynamics. Yeah. Because that, for me, is where the element of novelty is in the market dynamics, rather than the functional or the corporeal aspects of products. And secondly, of course, could try and perhaps identify the kind of externalities that shape what we call platform capitalism, which then again connects with my idea of the embeddedness of media markets, and therefore to what extent has platformization able to deal with this embeddedness of pre-existing media markets. And lastly, of course, I think a markets approach would also help us get a sense of the kind of particular blend between the specific and the universal layer. So are the ways in which platforms are unfolding in the US, are they unfolding in the same way in India or in other parts of the world there? So what happens when platforms get globalized? Do they metamorphosize? Do they sort of imbibe externalities from other jurisdictions? And if so, therefore, what happens to the nature of that market in an alien economy, so to say? So going beyond sort of building on this idea of kind of a markets approach towards platforms, there's sort of four rough building blocks that I've tried to identify. And therefore, the emphasis I use is that to try and think of platformization as a process rather than platforms as something which exist a priori, or something which have landed up without any kind of context there. So in a sense, to try and see platformization being the mix of these four, what I call building blocks there. Digitization, of course, being one of these building blocks. But more importantly, beyond technology, about how digitization formalizes certain kinds of transactions and social economies here. And that's perhaps, I think, central to understanding platformization. Yeah. Then, of course, are the two other building blocks, which are more often talked about. One, of course, is platforms as illustrating the wider mediatized nature of society. So the relationship between mediatization and platformization, and how perhaps the former contributes to the latter. But platforms also are ways in which markets get massified. They aggregate different kinds of products and services. Yeah. So there's this kind of massification, which is also central to the process of platformization. Yeah. And along with that, along with the process of aggregation, there is a parallel process of enclosure, which is taking place on these platforms. Yeah. So which, of course, then opens on to debates on openness on the internet and so on and so forth. Yeah. And of course, again, lastly, the big debate in terms of datafication, and is that perhaps one of the key traits of platform markets. And there's been discussion on the idea of legibility, which I think is a powerful way of understanding traits of platform markets. But I think that also connects with much older debates on the legibility, in this case, of citizens by the state as well. Yeah. So I think there is, and I've talked about this elsewhere in a recent paper, that the desire of market systems to make consumers legible has more or less a parallel and perhaps even an overlapping history with the desire of the state to make the citizens legible. And I think this perhaps might give us a more historical idea of legibility as a process, which of course far dates the advent of platforms. Yeah. So sort of based on this, one could try and propose a typology of platforms. And it's a kind of a four-way typology of understanding platforms. One, of course, one is looking at what most of us tend to encounter, which is media platforms, which are essentially an extension of the audiovisual economy, the extension of the intangible cultural economy. And then, of course, we have commodity platforms, which are an expansion of the tangible economy. So we're talking about goods and services which get delivered and distributed through platforms. And then we have what I would call exchange platforms, which are essentially formalizing social economies, economies of human relationships, economies of social relationships, economy dealing with religion, and so on and so forth. And that's a kind of different rendition of platformization. And then, of course, is the platformization of the state, and which I would therefore think of these types of platforms as governance platforms, which is essentially involving the deepening of the state, both in terms of its engagement with the citizens, and therefore you're talking about digital identity and so on and so forth, but also in the sphere of money, because money is a domain, currency is a domain of the state, and therefore the large number of investments in fintech and so on and so forth are very much part of what I would call governance platforms. So with this kind of, in light of this typology, I'll sort of take up two sides of platformization. One from these two different types. So one from media platforms, and I look at news, which has been, of course, talked about, and there's a fascinating amount of literature on that. And the other one is from what I would call exchange platforms. And I'll take up the unusual case of matchmaking as a social economy, and what happens to that when it gets platformized. This sort of combination of sites, so these two sites might appear to be a bit strange, and I think therefore perhaps it's important as to why I would like to talk about them in the same breath. Those of you who've been to India or seen a sort of Indian newspaper, as in a paper newspaper, proper newspaper, you would perhaps notice 4 broad types of content. One, of course, is news, which I guess over the years is also declining. But newspapers still carry news. The other one, of course, is advertisements, which is the big sort of revenue generator. And the other 2 forms of generating revenue are classified ads, which are largely ads from public institutions. And the last one, of course, is matrimonials. And matrimonials are essentially advertisements for arranged marriages. Let me sort of define a matrimonial in a straightforward way. So in society where there is a prevalence of arranged marriages, those arrangements need to be solicited. And at one point of time, they were being solicited face-to-face. But with the expansion of the press in the mid-20th century, especially on weekends, you can have up to 3 out of 12 pages which just have these matrimonials. And I'm taking the 2 sides of news and matrimonials to perhaps try and argue out in terms of how these building blocks of platformization unfolded in the case of news and unfolded in the case of matrimonials. So that's the kind of proposition I'm making here, is that 2 types of content which were at one point of time together in this product called newspapers, they then had their own trajectories of platformization. One, of course, led to platform news sites, which of course all of us are familiar with. But then the other one led to platforms which I would call deal with matchmaking, because they went beyond just marriages. And there are some interesting parallels between these 2 sites of platformization. And of course, what sort of brings them together for me is that both, in a sense, deal with information which is perishable. Okay, so the way in which perhaps last week's news does not make sense today, even on matchmaking platforms, once a transaction has taken place, one does not necessarily go back to a platform soliciting arranged marriages. I mean, that's perhaps would be the aberration. Okay, which of course has many consequences in the nature of the product, which I'll come to when I look at these 2 products in detail. So, of course, when you talk about digitization as a building block of platformization, we're not only talking about the electronic form of news, and therefore doing away with paper and, in a sense, news becoming part of this sort of intangible digital commodity. But in that process, the form itself of news and engaging with news has also undergone substantive changes. Both in the way in which we see news as information, the way in which we consume it, the whole idea of news sites being made compatible for mobile phones, for example, that's a very important part of this wider process of digitalization. And then, of course, the interdependencies of digital news with the wider digital economy. So that's sort of one or rather multiple processes which get subsumed under the idea of digitalization of news. Yeah. The second part, of course, is the way in which news gets mediatized. Yeah. And here again, perhaps beyond aspects of form in terms of multimedia and the circulation of that, what becomes important is the way in which these different forms tend to get accessed and circulated there. So not only can I read news on a screen, but I can also perhaps choose to listen to what is in front of me on the screen. Yeah. I can share it in ways across different types of other non-news digital networks. Yeah. And that essentially is the heart of the challenge which is there today between news sites which have got platformized and the intermediaries, in a sense, who are tempering the entire platform economy. Yeah. Massification, again, is extremely visible, both in terms of the massification of products, which is different kinds of media content and non-media content are aggregated on these news platforms. And hence, of course, the shift from distribution of news to the discovery of news, yeah, which is, of course, a ongoing thesis there. But massification also is happening in terms of geographical markets. So multiple geographical markets are then getting aggregated and compressed on one particular platform, which of course becomes important when we are talking about a very large news economy, which is multilingual. So there are perhaps at least 6 Indian languages where the consumption of newspapers is more than in several European countries, for example. So a news conglomerate publishing in multiple languages across multiple territories is then able to massify its markets. And of course, at the same time, also fragment that. So the whole process of massification and fragmentation of markets then is something that gets rendered through the platformization of news. And as part of this process, of course, there are practices through which once content gets aggregated and massified, it also gets enclosed. So both through technological and legal means, products which have been aggregated needs to go on simultaneously. And that again, perhaps is something which might define the way in which platformization of the entire intangible cultural products have unfolded over a period of time. Yeah. I think in terms of datafication, which of course attracted a lot of interest there, I think one part of it is to do with the enumerative capability of platforms. Okay, and so in a sense to make visible the behavior of those who are using these platforms, which of course then leads to the whole the idea of platforms business essentially being a business of metrics. Okay, and therefore, when are we talking about when we talk about the data economy? Are we talking about that data itself being the key product, or are we talking about the metrics on the data being the product which is actually getting transacted and has value around that? I think there's an interesting distinction made between metrics which are supposed to be useful to the user, representational metrics, and metrics which are useful and generated therefore for those who are providing the services and products. So this whole idea of datafication of information then connects with debates on older debates again on the nature and use of metrics in media markets here, and to what extent is the hold over these metrics defining the way in which decisions in the markets are taken, and of course, more importantly, regulatory decisions are taken based upon this idea of metrics. Most of it, I guess, would be familiar to all of you, because sort of there are some rather universal tendencies in what I talked about earlier. Yeah. Just some attention on perhaps the peculiarities of the platformization of news in India. And I think one of the important aspects of this is the fact that in large parts of the world, news outlets were compelled to digitize themselves because readership was dropping here. Whereas what we see in India is that you are having news outlets getting platformized together with the expansion of readership. Yeah. So these two processes are happening simultaneously. Readership is expanding. Readership of newspapers, of paper newspapers, is expanding, but at the same time, platformization of news outlets is also expanding. Yeah, and therefore, I have always sort of made the case of talking about digital expansion rather than digital migration, which is a more commonly used phrase when we talk about digitization, especially in comparative terms. Yeah. So in a sense, what we are witnessing is a digital expansion, which adds to the existing readership rather than trying to sort of recover the readership which is actually being lost there. Two other things which perhaps also make it peculiar in the way in which platformization of news in India has unfolded is that it's being driven by cash-rich newspapers, because newspaper conglomerates are expanding themselves there. They are rich. They are rich entities there, unlike in many other parts of the world there. So it's not the compulsion of falling readership of newspapers, nor is the lack of cash, which is faced in other parts of the world because of falling readership. But both these factors are working positively, and therefore they are driving the platformization of news. Yeah. I think what is also important perhaps to keep in mind that a large number of news outlets, including newspapers themselves, are part of much larger diversified industrial conglomerates. And therefore it's diversified industrial capital, which is actually driving the platformization of news outlets in India. Yeah. And of course, lastly, there are extremely noticeable regulatory silences, which tend to enable legacy actors in the news business to continue to accumulate interests in the online news economy. And since I'm referring here to weak or extremely porous cross-media regulation in India, that's again perhaps a strong distinction from other large media economies. Yeah. So therefore, with weak cross-media regulations, there would be a tendency for legacy actors to accumulate interests even in the frontier parts of the media economy. Yeah. I think we see a similar kind of process emerging when we're talking about the platformization of matchmaking. Yeah. As I said earlier, perhaps the earliest, as I said earlier, the first set of matrimonials, as in advertisements for marriages, emerged in the newspapers in the 1950s. Yeah. And of course, the preferences for the propositions which were being made were pretty clear in terms of caste, complexion, community, religion, and so on and so forth. So all these kind of sociological characteristics were very prominent in the pitch which was there in these advertisements. Yeah. Of course, you also have now recent matrimonials adding that the person concerned is also COVID vaccinated. Yeah. So there are these kind of filters which are built into the proposition which is being made there. By the sort of mid 90s, many of these companies offering matrimonials started very primitive and crude websites. And there's been some work, therefore, in talking about the idea of matrimonial websites essentially functioning as the mechanization of kin work. Yeah. So if arranged marriages involve extended families, or therefore work by members of the kinship groups, then this perhaps could be the starting of the mechanization of work which are originally carried out by members of the family. Yeah. Very briefly, we did see matchmaking also taking the form of reality TV shows. There's some interesting work on Turkey in this, especially in the relationship between what happens when matchmaking moves to reality TV shows and the kind of interactions around that on instant messaging sites. Okay, so the coming together of two different types of platforms. But then again, the digitization of matchmaking then also involves other kinds of platforms, which at one point of time were totally distinct. And here I'm referring to the earliest instant messaging applications. So just like in newspapers, even in the platformization of matchmaking, we see multiple waves of digitization that affect the social economy of matchmaking in different ways, but all of them pushing them towards what we today could see or today understand as the kind of pre or the proto history of marriage platforms. Yeah, there is an intense mediatization of these platforms. So it's not just now looking at photo albums, which you perhaps could not see when these matrimonials were in newspapers, but also sort of functionalities like live chat and so on and so forth. Okay, so this in a sense is kind of an example of a highly mediatized form of exchange that is unfolding on the platform. Yeah. I think two aspects of datafication here I would like to mention. One, of course, is the fact that some of the traditional filters, which in a sense reflect the embedded nature of the social economy, continue. So one of the key features of an arranged marriage is matching the birth chart of the two people involved there. Okay. And therefore, these birth charts, they had got digitized about at least 20 years ago. Yeah. They are then offered as an affordance on these platforms. Yeah. So besides comparing other favorable or preferred kind of features, marriage platforms also then provide the opportunity to compare birth charts of the sort of the bride to be and the groom to be, so to say. But the other thing which is really striking for me, and this is what got me interested in looking at matchmaking platforms, is that all these advertisements, and of course now they function as filters, are examples where people are willingly and explicitly providing highly granular data. And this, in a sense, for me, is rather ironical with all the talk of privacy which has been happening on the internet. Yeah. So on the one hand, there is the anxiety about behavior, taste, demographics getting mined. But here is a case where the users are actually willingly providing all this kind of data because that data is important to make the match. Okay, and this is an irony I'm kind of dealing with here. As to, it's perhaps for me the only example where users provide extremely granular data, which is otherwise not mineable by the metrics business. Okay. And this perhaps also could be one of the defining traits of this kind of exchange platform in this part of the world there. Going back to the other building blocks, massification happens, of course. So not only are then matchmaking sites able to transcend geographies within the country, but also, of course, across the country. So on these large matchmaking sites, there will be microsites for diaspora. Yeah. Many of the matchmaking entities have then expanded their services to getting into the actual wedding business. Yeah. So this is a clear case of vertical integration in the matchmaking market. Yeah. Massification also, of course, is happening by offering new kinds of products. Yeah. And at least the first. So they're kind of niche matchmaking sites, or a large matchmaking site would also offer have something to offer for a niche user, which of course is also there in other parts of the world there. So matchmaking for divorcees, for those who have served in the army, and so on and so forth there. But then, of course, we also see other kinds of offerings emerging, which then get aggregated within this. And one of them is dating platforms. And that's kind of interesting, because here we are talking about two totally different types of social economies, two different types of relationships, both of which are then getting aggregated and being offered on a single platform. It's an interesting shift about why would a marriage platform then expand its services into a dating platform, which otherwise would sort of seem to convey two different types of markets. I think one of the sort of issue which comes up here is the temporality of this particular kind of social exchange. That matrimonials in that sense are a perishable product, and once the deal is struck, so to say, there is no use of that particular platform. Okay. But because of the expansion and the expansion of marriage platforms into dating platforms, and the advent of dating apps from other parts of the world, the question is that can we look at dating apps and matrimonial apps as substitutes, or do they sort of continue to sort of stand for two totally different types of social exchange? There was a quick and dirty study done by one of the leading trade bodies here, which suggested that very often folks are actually using dating apps with the purpose of marriage in mind here, because the data provided on dating apps is far more granular than that provided on marriage apps. Okay. So the issue of substitutability then within a particular platform market then becomes important here. The other part is, of course, what happens when platforms travel across borders. Something which I began with. So what happens with the globalization of Tinder? Does Tinder, for example, or OkCupid, does it work the same way in different jurisdictions, in different cultures, and so on and so forth? So what we found out was that there was this clear process of the domestication of global platforms. So global platforms had to start, or chose to start, using filters, which they would not perhaps use in other jurisdictions. Okay, so for example, a filter for social and political values. Okay, what do you think of a particular kind of agitation? Okay, that then becomes a filter on a dating app. Okay, and we also see the other way around, which is that domestic platforms are also getting reformulated. So some of the Indian dating apps, what we noticed there is that the absence of traditional filters such as caste, complexion, religion, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there is this process of domestication of global platforms as they expand in the Indian market. At the same time, there is this sort of reformulation of domestic platforms to reach out to different kinds of possible consumers and users there. Which then, of course, brings me to the peculiarities of matchmaking platforms. I mean, there's been some work done in Vietnam on this, on Korea, and of course, some studies in the US as well, in terms of matchmaking platforms, especially dating platforms. Yeah, most of those tend to sort of focus on issues of privacy and safety and so on and so forth, which of course are important issues. But I think what is perhaps the key here is that the kind of typology of matchmaking platform, or the subtype of matchmaking platforms, essentially is institutionalizing a pre-existing offline market. So there was this sort of pre-existing social economy of arranged marriages, which has then got rendered itself in a particular way because of the platformization of these practices there. And in that process, kind of matchmaking practices, which typically had a long tail, because matchmaking practices start from a neighborhood and they go across to different parts of the states and so on and so forth. If all these sort of little matchmakers, in a sense, are getting therefore aggregated on this form of mechanized kin work, quite clearly, this social economy is getting highly concentrated, and I'm talking in terms of in business terms. And then, of course, the point which I just talked about, the peculiarity in the Indian case is about the dynamics of domestication by global platforms as they enter more complex markets, and not necessarily in response to that, but perhaps also in parallel, the reformulation in the platform practices of domestic players. Yeah. And I think a large part of this then comes down to the fact of the embedded nature of these particular economies of exchange, yeah, which then gets reflected in those affordances that you see on these platforms. Yeah. So perhaps the argument here is that what we see as distinct affordances offered by platforms are perhaps a result of far older and embedded kind of practices, which result in the way in which we see we see a screen in a particular way in a particular country, as opposed to seeing the screen of the same platform player in another country. It's not only in terms of functionality, but in this case of exchange platforms, because of the nature of those social economies, there are certain compulsions that ensure that the interface with the users are very different. I don't know how long, I can't see my clock on this because I got the full screen here, but perhaps it could be, Brett.
Yeah, we're a little over time, but
Oh, okay.
So
okay. So that's where I'm kind of just summing up some of the points which I talked about earlier. And the fact that the platformization process in India essentially is a reflection of the embedded nature of media markets, of embedded nature of pre-existing media and information markets, and also a reflection of the kinds of regulatory responses that have unfolded to the tendency of platformization. Yeah, I think I'll just stop here right now. Yeah, sorry about going overboard there. I couldn't see my thing here. Yeah.
Oh, no worries. Very interesting. I noticed there's a lot of activity in the chat, but to begin, we'll turn it over to Geert, who will be the discussant on this.
Thanks, Vibodh. Let me start with a very basic distinction that I want to talk with you about between platforms and platformization, because there seem to be different things. And of course, your talk was mainly about the verb, the activity, the transformation of these existing media markets, which you really emphasized, and you gave a really good overview and a few very good examples there. Can you say something more theoretical about, what is for you the difference between platforms and platformization? Start with that.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the verbing part is something which I think you picked upon there. And I think the idea of looking at sort of the platforms are more sort of understood in terms of the objects that users deal with, as opposed to what's kind of happening behind the screens and the phones and so on and so forth. So that's in a sense, and I'm more interested in that, which is why I sort of thought about verbing the idea of platforms, and whether that would then open up ways to look at structures and the changing nature of those structures over a period of time. So that's the kind of way in which I would sort of differentiate between how I would use these terms.
Yeah, thanks. I think also there's an element there, and you pointed to that also, starting off in the 90s, of growing first networks, then in the Web 2.0 period, more, what was called user participation, turning into social media, and now becoming full-fledged markets. And I see that development very clearly. So it is really about a kind of a total mobilization of the readership, the audience, or the users, give it a name, right? That in the past, were more or less passive. They were, of course, measured, and their opinion was important. And if they didn't like something, they didn't buy it. So they had some possibilities to participate. But nowadays, it's not just an opinion. They are full participants at the very center of this activity, namely, they're the other side in the supply and demand question, right? So they are not, in a way, secondary. Would you say that in India, they're also completely considered, full members? Or do you think there are still some remnants of this old way of looking at people participation as audience?
I think that there is still a very large and sizable offline economy. Okay, and I think so. Perhaps one way could be to see that as the remnant, as you said. I think the other thing would be perhaps to try and see what is the way in which the offline economy, whether it's in news or in platforms or in matchmaking platforms, what's the interaction between the offline and the online economy? Okay, are there ways in which the platforms are catering to the offline? Okay, so for example, one thing which we noticed was the fact that the very fact that, one example I talked about, the very fact that marriage platforms have now also gone into organizing marriages. Okay, so that's a very sort of that's a very classic example of the online capabilities are actually being leveraged to strengthen their power in the offline market. Okay, so these sort of small localized marriage logistical entities, that kind of work is then also taken on by the platforms there. So that's kind of one way, but it remains offline now. Okay, so tasks which were offline remain offline, but those tasks then get sucked in to this process of aggregation by platforms. I think a large amount of advertising, and that's the other content which I didn't talk about today, but a large amount of advertising for the online economy actually happens offline there. Okay, so that sort of leads then questions of kind of market strategy. Why would a product which is only sold online be advertised offline? Okay.
Yeah.
That
I have a thesis, and I'm curious what you make of it. I read your platformization of existing media markets in part also as a response to the absence of, let's say, sovereign all-Indian platforms that have been developed, by the national, let's say, venture capital, IT firms, right? India obviously is primarily focused on Silicon Valley and the American market, is seeing itself as in competition with China, but it's not really the uptake in China of the really big Chinese platforms, is considerable, but if you look at the numbers, really economically speaking, not that significant. It could very well be, but it just didn't work out. So India is in a way a little bit squeezed between these two very large platform economies, America on the one hand and China on the other, and this doesn't leave much, to the national IT elites to really develop fully fledged, let's say, sovereign platforms. When we're talking about an Indian, really promising, alternative to Amazon on the one hand and Alibaba on the other, just to name, some, or India, as a huge market, one of the biggest in the world, could very, very well develop its own search engine like Russia does, and China, or develop even social media alternatives. It didn't, and instead it went into this platformization of existing media markets, because that was something obviously neither Silicon Valley nor the Chinese were able to do, and were even legally speaking entitled to do, unless they would, of course, take over these news sites or newspapers or dating sites, etc. That, as you already said, are firmly embedded in existing industrial conglomerates. So that's not really a possibility for those outside players. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so I think the engagement with sort of the outside is interesting. Is that so? On the one hand, there's a lot of talk about the domestic sort of platform economy, that there are these new entities. I mean, like some of the matchmaking sites I talked about, which are indigenous, or the fintech companies and so on and so forth. Okay, but especially in fintech, from what I gather, a large a number of them do have Chinese capital there. Okay, so, and this is of course also caused a kind of a political debate in terms of how do you understand an indigenous platform there? Are you talking about it in terms of traditional ideas of R&D? I mean, so that's the kind of sort of Silicon Valley kind of model. Are we talking about ownership and control? You know, irrespective of where the backend comes from. Okay, or are we talking about purely in terms of what the kind of, you know, majority shareholders being Indians and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that I think is an interesting part about the, you know, can we talk about domestic platforms there? Okay, and this I think goes even to the other space, related space of telecommunications there. So on the one hand, you do have very large Indian telecom players there. Okay, Indian owned and controlled there. But they are actually service providers, because they actually networks, which is behind the services, are built by, you know, foreign companies there, whether it's Ericsson or Microsoft and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think it becomes important perhaps to try and look at what is behind that platform to tell us in terms of the idea of to get into discussions about domestic versus foreign there. And I think the similar kind of thing is unfolding in the in money platforms or in the kind of fintech space here. At the same time, when it comes to governance platforms and sort of platforms which are looking at biometrics and so on and so forth, yeah. And I think there perhaps the state has a much more explicit sort of role there. And that's where sort of the Indian IT elite, as you talked about, together with the state, is trying to create, or has created, a platform which is kind of cordoned off from the rest of the world. But that, of course, is because of the strategic needs of the state, because the governance platform, by definition, would have to be sovereign. Yeah. But of course, at the same time, there is also talk about the biometrics platform being exported to other countries. Yeah. So in terms of their sovereignty, then would also get sort of, so there is this kind of crisscrossing of ideas of foreign and domestic and local and global, which are not as apparent if one goes purely as a user or by the discourses created by platforms themselves. You know, there is a desire for all platforms, global platforms, to demonstrate their Indianness. That's something which is happening at one level there. But at the same time, there is also a desire to show greater kind of integration with the global economy. And I think these two processes at some point of time would be in tension with each other. Yeah. As it happened in other sectors of the information media economy earlier. Yeah. Telecom being the best example of that. Yeah.
You have not emphasized, an element that returns in the Western canon and literature debates a lot when spoken about platforms and platform capitalism, and that's the inherent nature of platforms to scale up very rapidly, to become very, very large, to then become, a monopoly. And some say that this is the very nature, the very definition of platforms, right? And in that sense, they are very different from decentralized networks and so on, right? So this is the centralized versus the decentralization debate. Is this playing out in India as well? Because the Indian market itself is so huge, so it would make so much sense to scale up, even if you would really limit yourself to the Indian market itself. These entities can become immensely big in potential. Is there any debate about that?
Yeah, so I refer to it in terms of kind of aggregation and the accumulation of interests by legacy players there, and that then is the kind of argument being used by domestic players, the domestic majors, for the state to try and fortify itself from the global economy. Yeah. Okay, and I think. Reliance Industries Limited, in that sense, is the largest diversified conglomerate in India, which is also now emerging as the largest player in the platform economy. So I think what you're saying is then becomes a strong argument to sort of develop not just a national but a nationalist rendition of platforms. Okay, but the question, of course, is that given the technological nature of platforms, where all activities don't happen necessarily in a single jurisdiction, is that feasible? Okay, and I think that's where perhaps.
Well, the Chinese would say yes, as you know.
So that's kind of, there the idea is that there's a complete massification of all tasks. All tasks which concern a platform are aggregated within a jurisdiction, not necessarily within a company, but also within a jurisdiction. Whereas here, perhaps the tasks may be aggregated within a particular kind of company, but it might overflow into other jurisdictions. Having said that, of course, the big emphasis now has been in terms of investment in data centers, clouds, and so on and so forth. So that's where the kind of the back end or the hard infrastructure of platforms to try and bring that within sovereign control is something beneficial both for the state and for large conglomerates. So there's a sort of clear overlap of interests between what could be called national capital and the state itself.
Can you be very brief and say something about, is there a Modi government policy on platforms as we speak, or
I think
it's something happening?
I think in bits and pieces, at least in terms of the infrastructure. I mean, both on clouds, nothing really substantial has happened, but I think the data centers part, and of course they're both part of the. Can't talk about cloud and data center separately. But in terms of the regulation of cloud, which is the sort of more intangible part of it, and the creation of data centers, I think one can sort of start thinking about a kind of move to a mercantilist sort of state. Okay, and this is something which I'm trying to argue with two colleagues in a paper coming out next year. That can we think? I mean, if we have a kind of a more a wider idea of mercantilism, then can we think of a mercantilist state which is actually driving a certain imagination of platforms? Okay, but again, the roots of this, at least roots of some elements of this, go back to earlier regimes. And that's essentially because of the voice of dominant actors, both in the pre and in the pre-platform economy, and also within the platform economy. And I think some of those trends are seen in parts of Europe as well. But there, of course, the boundary of the fortress is not necessarily countries, but is the EU itself. And I think that is a kind of different way of trying to fortify EU from both Silicon Valley on one side and China from the other side. And the engagements with Facebook and Google, especially over the last 2 years in Germany and so on and so forth, are clear indications of this kind of fortification, or at least defining the terms of engagement with transnational players. Yeah.
Do you see a specific agenda coming from Bangalore or Hyderabad and the IT elites there that want to subscribe to this or counteract these let's say new legal regimes that might come up? I can imagine they might have another political agenda.
Well, it's one of that ground where part of it is in their interest and part of them it is not in their interest. Yeah. And that's typically the problem which faces national capital all over the world at all points of time in history. Yeah. Okay. So the question, of course, is that where is that boundary drawn? Yeah. Or rather, what are the actors that benefit if a boundary is drawn at a particular place? Yeah. But I think, yeah, I mean, that's the way I would sort of put it as of now. I have not sort of done interviews with the kind of IT elite, so to say, but sort of looking at the literature which has come out over a period of time, from the time when the IT elite were actually just servicing offshore companies. I mean, that's where the elite began. So
yeah, Infosys, all this. Yeah.
So the IT, what is today's IT elite, actually began as providing services to the global economy, which is offshoring and outsourcing itself, which has then grown to a scenario whereby then it's capable of generating its own products for the domestic market, no doubt, but also for the export market. Yeah. And I have not really sort of had substantive interactions with them, or at least at the decision-making level with them, to get a sense of how do they see this sort of negotiation, both with a kind of getting a leverage from the mercantilist state, but at the same time also retaining a sense of a kind of liberal transnational economy. Whether these two ideas are compatible, or more importantly, in which sectors would they be compatible? They won't be compatible in, say, governance platforms. Yeah. They may be compatible in, let's say, commodity platforms, maybe in non-news media platforms. Yeah. And quite clearly in terms of all kinds of exchange platforms. Yeah. So perhaps those points where things become, those interests overlap of the digital elite, the IT elite, what you call, and the state, those points of overlap would become very interesting to study here. And what does that say over a period of time? Yeah.
So I was going to say,
let's open up the questions.
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left. It makes sense to open it up to the floor. So Gerrit, thank you so much for your discussion. Anshu, I see your hand there. Do you want to lead it off?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vibodh, for that really interesting talk and for the conversation that has been going on. But I just thought it's time for the audience to step in as well. So mine is just, a move towards that. So I was interested in the offhand remark that you made about, people actually parting with their, data about their private lives, about things that are really, really very significant to who they are as a people, and willingly parting with them. My question is really, what happens to the data once it goes there? I mean, you're willing to part with some data to a platform, but that's not necessarily saying that I want to share this with everybody. So what happens to that data is something that I would be interested in knowing. And does government have access to that through various ways in which it can, pressurize these platforms into sharing that data? So that's something I'm interested in. And my other quick question is about, the Pew Research survey that talked about India being a kind of a thali rather than, mishmash of things. And I was wondering, the kind of platforms that you were talking about in the matrimonial sites and so on, they do they seem to, in fact, create these kinds of, through the kind of filters that they have and so on, sort of exacerbate the kind of divisiveness that there is in society? So you kind stick to your kind of a thing. That seems to be happening generally in India these days, where divisiveness in society seems to have increased enormously. So I was interested in hearing your views on that as well.
Yeah, thanks for both of these, Anshu. So on the first one, I would also like to know what happens with the data. I think everybody on this in this forum would like to know what happens to the data. The question, of course, is what ought to happen to it legally. I think that is perhaps the way one can try and sort of address the question. And the data protection bill has been brewing for a long time, which defines certain kind of different types of data and so on and so forth. And the ways in which ownership and use rights over those data could be are sort of divided between the user, those who collect that, and the government there. So, I mean, one can talk about what the bill might say, and that would be an entire sort of discussion there. But that need not necessarily answer your question in terms of what actually is happening to it. Where is it stored? Who has access to it? And I think the interesting thing for me is on these marriage platforms is that once a match is made and that transaction is over, then that's sort of that data has it's off the screen, right? That match is no longer there. And the more of that happens, the more successful that platform would be, quite obviously. Okay. So what is happening then to a large amount of that kind of data which is at rest, as opposed to on sites where, such as a movie site or any other site, where there's this constant interaction between the user and the platform, and therefore dynamic data is constantly getting produced here. The other part of it is whether other actors in the economy have access to data. And this is again a kind of big sort of global debate in terms of what companies say and what companies do. And again, of course, what governments say and government do and so on and so forth. The divisiveness thing is interesting. I've not looked at matrimonials in newspapers over a long period of time. But from what I've looked at, I mean, the very fact of putting down certain kind of preferences is in a sense taking one step towards what you're calling as divisiveness. The question, of course, is then do the newspapers organize certain kind of matrimonials together? And that has in a sense enhanced over a period of time. But with the use of filters, this kind of, I would use the word segregation rather than sort of divisiveness, happens much more easily, but that's the service that is being provided there. Now, whether that leads to segregation in the offline world, that perhaps would be something we would need to look into here. Or the other way around, which perhaps what you're hinting at is that with enhanced segregation in the offline world, does that sort of impact the kind of filters which are coming up there? And both of these processes would be happening simultaneously.
So I see another question from Tommaso, and if anyone else has a question, go ahead and put your hand up and I'll add you to the list.
Thank you, Vibodh. Very interesting presentation. I would like to know a little bit more about your concept of audio-visual economy, because so far I used to talk about the visual economy of the global as a condensation of different geographic scale of the global. in one single event or images. So I would like to know a little bit more about your concept of audio visual economy in regard to platform economy. Thank you.
Yeah. Just a second. I'm just putting some stuff. I was just also looking at the chat. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess you're referring in this case to the sort of four-way typology, which I was talking about earlier, where the first type was this idea of the audiovisual layer. I think that emerged out of the idea of the fact that in both cases, in the case of commodity platforms and media platforms, in both cases, what is actually being sold are commodities. Yeah. The question here is that in one case, we're talking about the exchange of and the circulation of intangible commodities. So songs, music, and cinema and videos and so on and so forth. Yeah. So that, in a sense, is traditionally what is seen as a kind of media economy, as opposed to the idea of the communication economy or the wider kind of information economy. Yeah. So that's the way I would sort of draw a difference between. I mean, traditionally the binary has been between sort of software and hardware. Okay, and therefore, when we talk about the media economy, we are essentially largely talking about the software part of it. Yeah. Okay, but of course, what complicates the fact is that in case of platforms, this distinction does not necessarily hold true here. Amazon, of course, is the biggest example of that, but we also have within India. I mean, I talked about Reliance Industries. Are players who are, in a sense, dealing with commodities offered by both types of platforms. Yeah. So that's the way I would still stick to the traditional distinction of audiovisual as an intangible products and intangible quantities and tangible commodities, which we then buy on other sites of Amazon, so to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I guess next we'll go to Britta Lucia, and then I saw that Jan had a question too.
Is it me? Is it me?
Yes.
You're asking to talk? Hi.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry,
I don't put the video on. I'm not presentable. But I just have a question do you hear me? Do you hear me all right?
Yep.
Good. Regarding the question of expanding platforming and digitization and the rather disconcerting fact of internet shutdowns, India has had the largest number of internet shutdowns of all, not only of democracies, but of all countries. And coming back to what Gerrit Loving said just now, of this kind of middle position between China and, or the squeezed position between China and the US. I mean, China has built sort of an alternative internet, so to speak, for its users in many respects. India is trying to insert itself into what can still be called a kind of fractured or kind of limited, increasingly limited global digital universe, and is at the same time trying to control and to regulate and to curtail contexts, contents, activities, particularly when it comes to state violence or opposition against the state. So how do actually users, I don't know, I know you didn't do research on that, but is there sort of a general agreement to being disciplined, as I mean, India has a long history of censorship on all media, apart from the press maybe, a sort of general consent towards being regulated in a actually non-legal manner, because as far as I see it, there's no legal background to these abrupt internet shutdowns. When we look at Kashmir, for example, how is this going together with the urge of expansion, which is there in the digital sphere? And yeah, maybe you can just kind of expand on that for a moment.
Yeah, are you through? Yeah.
Yeah, I have finished, Vibodh.
Okay, yeah. So I think it goes back to the conversation with Gert, as you're rightly saying, is that there are perhaps two ways in which this is unfolding here. And quite clearly, when we're talking about the ideas of platformization and the investments in the infrastructure required for that, that then that's a sort of a different kind of market as opposed to the markets of shutdowns. Yeah. Again, I would perhaps try and look at the idea of shutdowns in terms of from a kind of markets perspective as well. Yeah. So here, in a sense, there is a certain there is a market for certain kind of commodities and content to be circulated, and there is quite obviously another kind of market to sort of curtail that. Yeah. So, and it's perhaps not uncommon, as you yourself had said, for the state to perhaps to respond in different scales. So, if the question is that does the expansion of platformization is that contradicted by internet shutdowns? Then, for me at least, my answer would be no, because in all spheres of the economy, one is able to see that these two what seem to be contradictory processes have unfolded over a period of time. Yeah. Does that sort of address? So I won't see it as an anomaly or an exception or even a hurdle to platformization. Yeah.
Well, there's which has been increasing massively over the last. So there's a dynamics to it which might come to a point where you think, okay, our actual interests and interests of platformers. We have a digital law which is also kind of course, curtailing their actions and is trying to make them susceptible to government policies. There might be a point where there is a contradiction in the offing, so to speak. I mean, you can't go intensifying both streaks at the same time endlessly. Precisely.
So this is what I was saying earlier about that the engagement between the so-called IT elite and the state. That engagement, or at least that negotiation, after a certain point of time, would perhaps move only in one way. And you're talking more about content, but I see the same thing happening in terms of infrastructure as well. So what part of the infrastructure ought to be owned by the state? And what part of it can be legitimately owned by private capital, either domestic or foreign? That itself is one way to sort of understand this. Yeah. Does the state own the backbone and everything else is owned by private players? Or does the state also involve private players in creating the backbone so as to have a better control over the entire network?
Yeah. So we're just we've just about come up to time. Jan, did you want to have a last word?
Just a word of thanks then, please. Vibodh, what a very interesting overview. I want to view it again to get a sense in relation here to what you said. I'm thinking also that a remark that an Indian colleague made to me a few days ago, that the Quad with AUKUS forms also an Anglo world within Asia, and may lead some people to take a step away. Countries like Thailand and so forth may then distance themselves from Australia and so forth. And this may also involve something of a divide, the Anglo world of Indian platforms is very different, can align with Silicon Valley, but is very different from the Chinese world. So to what extent does language make a difference? At any rate, I very much appreciate the whole this discussion. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So thank you so much to Geert, to Vibodh. It's 2:30 a.m. In Delhi right now.
And there is no cricket any longer. Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us. Next week we'll be hosting Max Ahe from Wageningen University, who's going to be talking about a people's Green New Deal. So hope to see everybody there. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jan, Brett, and Geert.
Thanks to you all, folks.